In August 1680, a coordinated indigenous alliance launched a lightning-fast strike across New Mexico. Within weeks, they burned colonial churches to the ground, killed hundreds of settlers, and forced the Spanish Empire out of the region. This photograph of Taos Pueblo shows the sophisticated multi-story adobe architecture that existed long before European arrival. The people who orchestrated that 1680 revolt did not live in an empty wilderness. They operated from highly structured, established societies fully capable of commanding armies. The European arrival in the Americas did not result in peaceful settlement. Instead, it triggered a brutal three-century world war for continental dominance. When the Ottoman Empire cut off the ancient Silk Road in 1453, European states had to find new routes to wealth. Nations like Spain, France, and England launched aggressive corporate-backed imperial expansions across the Atlantic. Each arrived with a distinct operational blueprint. Spain drove south and west, extracting gold and demanding subjugation. France moved north along the rivers, prioritizing the lucrative fur trade and strategic native alliances. England pushed onto the eastern seaboard, aggressively taking land to build rigid religious communities. Yet for all their wealth and military technology, not one of these empires was prepared for the blowback from the millions of people who already owned the land. The early stages of European encroachment relied heavily on commerce rather than armies. The massive European demand for beaver pelts and local resources overturned traditional native economies, turning previously stable regions into hyper-competitive resource extraction zones. Then came the pathogens. Diseases like smallpox wiped out huge swaths of the indigenous population. To replenish their numbers, native tribes escalated traditional captive-taking rates, known as mourning wars. Fueled by newly acquired European firearms, these once limited rivalries escalated into lethal existential conflicts. Native nations adapted to the chaos. They operated as highly militarized political players, actively maneuvering to survive a sudden, catastrophic shift in regional power dynamics. While merchants disrupted the economy, another group of Europeans arrived to target the social fabric. Missionaries deployed across the continent to rewrite the spiritual beliefs of the indigenous populations. Looking at this Spanish mission in California, you can see the massive institutional scale of their operation. Spanish Franciscans forced native peoples into reductions, sedentary settlements that functioned as forced labor camps. The close quarters spread disease rapidly, resulting in mass death and systematic cultural erasure. On the East Coast, English Puritans deployed a similar tactic. They isolated indigenous converts in closely monitored praying towns, designed explicitly to sever ties to native heritage and strip away political autonomy. The French Jesuits took a more insidious approach. Instead of building walled compounds, they walked directly into Huron and Algonquin villages, learned the local languages, and lived among the people. By exploiting existing political fractures, they slowly broke native social structures from the inside out. Whether through brute force or quiet assimilation, these tactics weaponized religious conversion. It served as a calculated tool to fracture indigenous kinship networks and secure loyal imperial subjects without firing a single shot. But the relentless European hunger for land made coexistence impossible. By the late 1600s, the fragile networks of trade and diplomacy collapsed into open, violent conquest. This engraving shows Metacom, the Wampanoag leader known to the English as King Philip, holding a European musket. In 1675, Metacom formed a massive native alliance and turned European military technology directly against the colonizers. His forces attacked over half the towns in New England, burning a dozen of them to the ground and pushing the colony to the brink of collapse. This resistance was a continent-wide reality. When you look at the sheer scale and density of the Aztec capital depicted here, you see the size of the formidable empires Europeans had to combat. The Aztecs and Incas fielded massive armies that inflicted catastrophic casualties on the invaders. Facing organized, lethal retaliation from native populations forced the European powers to face a hard reality. Absolute command and control of the Americas was an unsustainable illusion. By the late 1600s, the initial pools of exploitable labor were drying up. Disease had decimated native populations, and those who survived were increasingly organized and resistant to Spanish and Portuguese forced labor systems. To fuel expanding sugar and tobacco markets, European powers turned to the transatlantic slave trade. It provided the coerced workforce required for industrial plantations. Shipping records, like the Brooks Stowage Plan, reveal the industrialized geometry used to move millions across the Atlantic. This move from failed indigenous subjugation to enslaved African labor permanently cemented a brutal new racial hierarchy across the hemisphere. Colonization of the Americas was a desperate, chaotic, and brutal struggle for global wealth. And despite being battered by disease, displaced from ancestral lands, and repeatedly betrayed by treaties, the indigenous populations were never passive victims in this process. They actively fought back, and they never vanished. The modern borders of the Americas we know today were not drawn by the quiet stroke of a pen. They were carved by fierce resistance, written in religious zealotry, and paid for in blood.